There we go. You should get a message about that. Okay. So we are recording this meeting, and all messages that are sent through chat for reference later. And we're going to post the recorded webinars for anyone who didn't get to see it or wants to see it again, hopefully this December. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat feature. We will have a Q&A after the presentation, but feel free to ask questions as we go along or make comments. I'll compile any of the questions or comments, and we'll get to them during the Q&A. If we don't get to your question during the Q&A, we will continue the discussion on Facebook throughout the week, and we can answer any remaining questions there. All right, so I'm Mindy Babbitts. I'm Vice President of the Bear Care Group. Again, welcome everyone to the Bear Care Group's first ever webinar series. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bear Care Group, we're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to foster improvements in global bear welfare and conservation through communication, cooperation, and education among international bear care professionals. And one of the ways that we do this is by offering educational opportunities such as this webinar series. Now, today's webinar is by our very own Angela Gibson about incorporating winter dormancy into your husbandry routine. Angela is the social media and communications officer for the Bear Care Group, and she's been on our board since 2016. She's currently the zoological manager at Oakland Zoo in California. She has a master's degree in biology and is passionate about improving the welfare of bears under human care, with a primary focus on the husbandry needs of North American species. Angela is also on the steering committee for AZA's Bear Taxon Advisory Group. So I will now turn this over to Angela to talk to us about the seasonal needs of temperate bears.
Hello. Thank you guys for joining us today. Really appreciate having the time to chat with everyone. I'm excited to hear your questions and kind of share my knowledge about getting dormancy into your husbandry routines and helping that be as a smooth process as possible for you. So let me get everything loaded. Oh, there's too many things in my way. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so as Mindy said, today I'm going to talk to you guys about incorporating winter dormancy into your husbandry routine. And we're going to start today by talking about the different cycles that bears go through, and then go back through those cycles and discuss different considerations that you can bring in for best practices for your temperate bears. Feel free to ask questions as we go. Mindy will alert me if I need to answer a question at that point. We're also going to try some polls, which I haven't done before, so bear with me on those. And so that kind of helps me direct things I need to talk about. Got a little delay apparently on my computer. There we go. Okay, so brief overview of what are the internal cycles that temperate bears go through. And there's either 4 or 5 phases that people consider based on who you talk with. For today's discussion, we're going to talk about the 5 phases. So we have stage 1, which is torpor. This is where the lean body mass is preserved and body fat supplies the energy for going through torpor. In stage 2, we call that walking hibernation. Its biochemistry of hibernation is integrated into the physical activity. Food and water intake are minimal for temperate bears. Stage 3 is normal activity. Patterns are consistent with those of a non-hibernating species. Stage 4 is hyperphasia. This is where the animal increases all their fat reserves for hibernation. Stage 5 is what we call fall transition. And this is the period after hyperphagia where the metabolic processes begin to change to help prep that individual animal for hibernation. So a stage 1 torpor, to some level, every temperate bear goes through torpor, and it's really dependent on a lot of factors. And these include geography, the climate, internal cues, the bear's life stage, their health, their nutrition availability, and also competition issues. Torpor consists of periods of sleep. It's punctuated by periods of arousal. So they're not completely sound asleep during this entire time. Sleep is going to be the longest during the dead of winter and shorter and more easily disturbed on the fringes, so in the fall and early spring. And it has evolved as an adaptation for a lack of food resources and adverse weather conditions during winter months. But weather is not necessarily a requirement for denning. When you look at bears that are in southern latitudes, black bears are in Arizona, Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Florida, even here in California, ambient temperature is still pretty mild and the bears still den. So that means that bears are relying on internal cues and external cues to tell them when to go in and out of hibernation. Things like decreasing temperature and less daylight hours are some of the external cues that they're recognizing. Bears that rely on the internal cues that bears rely on are things like hormone leptin. And the leptin tells the bears that they have enough fat on board. This increases about 10 times the amount of their normal leptin levels and in about October. And that lets the bear know that they're nutritionally set to go into hibernation. So we'll talk briefly about some of the adaptations that they go through. One of the ones that I find fascinating is they go through gene expressions, and these genes are regulated, they're upregulated and downregulated depending on the time of year. And so you can think about this as like a panel of light switches turning it on and off. So these genes that are expressed for fatty tissues, there's about 2,000 that the bears upregulate, so they're turning them on, and about 1,800 that are downregulated for torpor compared to the active season. Things like respiratory rate changes, it goes down to about 1 to 4 breaths per minute. Heart rate decreases 8 to 19 beats per minute. And these also have genes associated to that help them prevent cardiac muscle loss during this time. Body temperature is held slightly below normal. Things like resting metabolic rate is approximately 73% of their normal rate. So a lot of cool things happen. Another interesting thing, at least I find interesting because I love diving into this stuff, is their normal platelets stay at a normal level, but they reduce their platelet function. And so what's interesting about that is that seems to tie to thrombosis during torpor. So they don't have any issues with that. And there's a lot of studies done for human health that are tying into all these cool things that the bears are doing when their genes upregulate and downregulate. Urine is still formed daily, even when they're in torpor, but it's resorbed into the bladder wall. So compared to an inactive human or a laboratory animal, after having these prolonged inactivity, bears should lose about 80% of their skeletal muscle strength and display severely impaired locomotive skills. But they only lose about 25%, and they're highly mobile if disturbed. Skeletal muscle mass is 8 to 10%, which is fairly minimal considering the length of time they could be denning. And so about 29% muscle loss will occur after a little over 100 days. But in a human, they would lose 54% of their muscle mass in just 90 days, even if they had good nutrition during that time. So really impressive. To maintain integrity of their fiber types and their muscle strength so that they can leave the den if disturbed. They have discovered that the bears go through different muscle contractions, shivering, and that also protects the muscles, but it also provides a little bit of heat, and that heat is dispersed across the muscles, but doesn't stimulate arousal, so they can kind of help keep themselves warm as well. They also don't lose skeletal structure. Their skeleton does not become porous like it would in humans. And this doesn't seem to matter how old the bear is. So even though they're every year doing this again and again, it doesn't chronically cause porous bones, when they're an older bear. So their bones don't become porous. They don't become weak and brittle from not using. They actually continue to have bone creating adaptations even while in torpor. Their circadian rhythm continues to function, and they are responsive to light, which is why they're easily disturbed when they're in a torpor state. They do wake up when they're in the dens. They shift around, as you can see in the video there of one of my bears denned up. And this is thought to kind of also help prevent pressure sores. We would get those sores if we were bedridden for that many months, but the bears do not. So even all of these adaptations that the bears are going through, which is, a huge list of stuff that happens, black bears, for example, will still expend about 4,000 kilocalories a day while they're in torpor. Dens are really important for bears to be denning up. Bears go into dens primarily based on environmental cues, but they leave a den come spring based on their body condition and physiological cues. Denning entry will vary based on the latitude, food availability, gender, age of the bear, reproductive status, climate conditions, things like that. We know that females will den longer than males, older animals will den longer than younger animals, and pregnant females will den the longest. Bears can den for as short as a week or two, depending on where they, what latitude they're at. But we can also see bears that den up to 7 months as needed. So definitely need a lot of fat reserves to do that. Some bears are known to come out of their den during during torpor, and they'll feed or move a short distances. There's a lot of examples of this when you look at Louisiana and Florida, where the bears will be down for a couple of weeks, get up, move around a little bit, and then go back into their den again. Dens are constructed with an entrance, then a short tunnel that leads to a chamber where the bear is making its nest. Black bears have a variety of den, probably the most variety of dens of the bears. And their variety will be based, again, on location, age, gender, health, if they're going to have cubs, all those kind of things. The milder the location, the more disturbance can happen for a denning bear. And their threshold is lower. And it's believed because if you think you're in a southern climate and it's warmer and you might have a little bit more food available, it's not as costly, especially a female with cub, to leave her den as it would be in the northern climates. So their threshold is a lot less. So stage 2, walking hibernation, is in the spring. This is when the bears emerge, and emergence is considered when they completely exit their torpor den. So it's not just them kind of poking their head out and going right back in. It can happen fairly early if you're having an unseasonably warm winter or in lower elevations. We see bears emerge as early as January and February. When outside the dens, bears will spend their time raking in more bedding to stay dry from melting snow or rainwater that's coming in. You can see them eating snow, drinking water to rehydrate. They're stretching, they're walking to regain muscle strength, and sometimes they're just laying in the sun to absorb that extra heat. Walking hibernation is still this period from den emergence where their metabolic process is not up to normal yet. It takes a slow adjustment to get it to normal. Your bears are still very lethargic in this state. It can last over a course of days or weeks. During this time, they may or may not eat. And if they do, it's going to be very little. And it's going to be based on what their fat reserves are. So they still need to rely on fat reserves when they're in walking hibernation. In the wild, there's still little to no food available. So what that means is the fat reserves and the concept of torpor, it begins in the fall, but it still goes into the spring. And so it's not just that winter denning period that their body condition has to be ready for. And that permits them to survive, if they do need to den up for a longer period or not. Their activity will slowly increase with availability of food and as the bears move away from their denning locations. The span of time it takes a bear to completely depart its den is just as varied as it is for when they first emerge. It's going to depend on weather. It's going to depend if there's cubs. A female's going to have to wait on those cubs to be large enough to climb trees if there's danger. But bears may vacate for a whole bunch of reasons. It could be that there's too much water going into the den and they can't stay dry anymore. They could, vacate just because it's time for that bear. Individuals that do not go through torpor, that are not hibernating, will stay in the state of what we call walking hibernation. So their metabolic process still decline. They just don't have the opportunity to den. Stage 3 is the normal phase. It's what we see during the summertime. It's what we consider from the green up of vegetation to the onset of hyperphasia. And this is where metabolic processes are normal from a non-hibernating animal. Animals at this time are eating 5,000 to 8,000 kilocalories per day. They have a pretty stable appetite, but they're eating a lot more diversity of food, and that appetite is increasing throughout the season. So diets at this time can include fruits, especially berries as they come on board, any overwintered nuts, insects, grasses, calves, if they've got, can catch any of those. They'll eat salmon, anything really that's available, eggs, etc. This is also when reproduction occurs. That's early in the season, and you'll see these animals travel great distances to find a mate. They're very social, but females with cubs will show a lot of avoidance behavior. An important part of their activity budget at this time of year is actually creating and using day beds. A day bed is any spot that the animal is curling up into and leaving an impression. And judging about the amount of time an animal spends using and building day beds in the wild, we've seen bears in Alaska at this time of year spend 31% of their time feeding. They're spending 10% of their traveling looking for mates, but they're spending 59% of their time still bedding from May to June and making these day beds. So that's why it's really important that we're providing enough substrate and varied locations of topography. And keep in mind that this time of year, the bears also need to have a lot of nesting opportunity. The most important drivers for day beds in the wild seem to be dense undergrowth, forests that regenerate, so they have vegetation that they can make their beds out of. And then again, a female with cubs is going to use locations that are away from other animals, so those cubs are protected. All right, stage 4, hyperphagia. It's the fun time of year where our animals are putting on excessive amount of fat reserves. And during this time, they have excessive amount of eating. They're drinking a lot of water due to all the food that they're taking in to flush their body of nitrogen waste. These animals are now going from what was about 8,000 kilocalories a day to up to 20,000 kilocalories a day or more. They're gaining 10 to 20% of body weight, which is about 4 to 5 inches of just fat alone that's going to be spread across their body, particularly spread around their rump and their rear. And I know you guys have probably been seeing a lot of the bears up in Alaska with all the competitions of the Fat Bear Week. So here you can see a couple of examples of how dramatic that weight gain can look like. These animals are really active at this time. Grizzly bears will be feeding 20 hours a day. Their appetite is almost insatiable. They'll shift their activity to avoid any competition from humans, competition from other bears. But because they're so desperate from calories, this is the time of year that bears easily become a nuisance bear due to human conflict, because they just need to get those 20,000 kilocalories a day. So this need to store fat actually changes the bear's food resources and what it wants to eat, which is called selective foraging. And they will shift from their summer diet where they're eating insects, they're still eating a lot of vegetation and plants, to a diet that's higher in fat and carbohydrates. So this is when they're wanting the fruits, they're wanting the berries in particular. They want nuts and salmon areas. They're going to be eating like the fat-rich eggs, skin, brain of the fish that they catch. And fat is really important. Fat is the tissue for these bears that orchestrates sparing all their other muscles and tissues. So they don't have enough fat. It does then therefore change their body condition. So people assume that as bears go through hyperphagia, that the fat just kind of sits there, it just accumulates, kind of like what it will for us, that it's just this reservoir if needed. But in fact, it's known that the fatty tissues are really, they're not inert at all. They're very metabolically active. They're driven by the expression of well over 1,000 unique genes just for using that fat reserves when they're in hibernation. And that change means that affects even things that we're doing when we're doing blood samples for our bears, or we're looking at any samples that the vets may be needing. You're going to see different ranges based on how active the fat reserves are at the time. Okay, stage 4, fall transition. This is in the fall. This obviously is after hyperphagia, when metabolic processes are changing and for the bear to prepare for hibernation. This is when the bears will start to voluntarily eat less, but they continue to drink a significant amount to continue to purge their body of any of the waste. They become increasingly lethargic. They're resting now about 22 hours a day, and usually you'll see them rest near water. So in hyperphagia, they were foraging for 20 hours, sometimes even more a day. And now over just the course of a couple months, they're going to be resting 22 hours a day. So a significant change in their activity budget. Active heart rates begin to fall, sleeping, respiratory rates begin to fall during this time. You're going to see the bears, they shift from a focus of just foraging to traveling to their den sites and building their winter den. It's seen often in the wild that even when there's still a lot of food available, a bear that's ready to go into torpor will leave a feeding grounds on their own. And the cue seems to be completely internal, that they're nutritionally fit and can go through torpor. So den selection is not completely understood with bears. Some travel many, many miles to find what they believe is a suitable area, and they'll start traveling pretty early in the fall. What we do know is heat preservation is one of the most important factors, and that is determined by the size of the den, the entrance of the den, how the entrance opens, ambient temperatures, how much snow cover or substrate cover. Is there flooding potential? Because that can definitely make a bear colder and costly to the cubs. It's known that bears will prefer a dry site where temperatures will be consistently below freezing over a den that may flood due to the energy cost. Nesting material is just as important as the den itself and the location of the den. They need enough bedding so that it helps them thermal regulate. They need bedding that helps plug the entrance of the den. They need to know that will be there if they have to vacate for some reason and get back into the den, that they've got enough vegetation to rebuild. And it also, if it does get a little wet from snow melt or rain, the thicker the bedding is, the drier the bears are going to stay. Other factors that can be important for den selection is going to be safety from predators, especially if it's a female that's going to have cubs. And we know that denning itself is so important to the process of bears going through torpor, because bears spend a significant amount of time excavating or building their dens, collecting vegetation, nesting for their nests, guarding the area. They'll spend days rearranging all those materials and the den entrance. So if you're going to devote that large amount of energy, that pretty much tells us this is really important for their denning process. Okay, let me see if I can do this. So right here, I'd like to run a poll real quick, just to kind of get an idea of how you guys are managing torpor in your environment before we go through considerations for husbandry. So we'll see if I get this correct. So you should have it pop up to ask you guys a question. This one is just single choice, so just select whichever one is the most fitting for your environment. And with these polls, I don't see who's inputting what. It's all anonymous, so don't worry about anything like that. Okay, looks like pretty much everyone has participated. And good to see. It looks like a lot of people believe they have a full natural torpor that they're allowing their captive bears to go through. Some have shallow torpors and variations of how they're managed. Okay. Thank you for participating in that. I really appreciate it. So we're going to go through what are some considerations for your husbandry practices. And all of this is going to vary based on your facility, your age of your bears, your latitude, so your climate and stuff that these animals are in. But what I want you guys to keep in mind through this entire discussion is it's important to allow our bears to manage their own torpor. Let them decide how long they need to go through, what their body conditions are, based on their external cues and their physiological state. This shouldn't be something that we are predetermining for them, but giving them all the choices and the resources necessary for them to manage themselves. Okay, so as we go through the husbandry tips, we're going to start at stage 2 instead of stage 1. So this is walking hibernation when the bears first wake up. And you guys are going to see emergence from your bears, which again is the start time when they come out of their dens. And when they're going to come out is going to vary across all your facilities. It's not something you guys can just predict and say, oh, yes, by February, our bears will be up. So they emerge based on temperature. Are they staying warm or not? They emerge based on their own individual fat reserves. Some will no longer find their den suitable for whatever reason. Maybe that's acoustic disturbances or temperature. Maybe their fat reserves aren't there and the bear next to them is. So they're being disturbed by social dynamics. But it could also just be time for that bear. Behavioral wise, when these animals get up, they're still incredibly lethargic. They're slow to make decisions. They're sleeping most of the day, and they may just come out and do the things we discussed earlier, stretch, enjoy the sun, take a drink. These bears at this time actually are really good at self-occupation. You'll see these animals sitting and fiddling with anything that's within their reach. So their nesting material, any browse that they have access to, and they'll just kind of self-entertain as they slowly warm up and slowly engage in their environment again. So when your bears have emerged, it's still really important as part of your husbandry routine that you let your bears still have 24 access to their den and make sure that they have enough dry bedding. If something did happen to that den, that you've been able to give them more bedding without disturbing them. Let them continue to focus on bedding and nesting behaviors, limit your disturbance in the area, and basically just continue to let them be. But when the bears actually depart their den, which will happen on an individual pace, so not all your bears are going to wake up at the same time and all be ready to go out into their environment. You have to just let the bears do it on their own pace. You're going to notice that the bears will start spending time further and further away from their den. They're going to show an increased interest in their environments as they transition through this time phase. They may switch from some of the self-occupation, manipulating objects like browse, to showing a little more interest in food-related objects, starting to wane the non-food related objects at this time. Interesting social pairings I've seen time and time again change when they come out of torpor. Bears that were tolerating each other, were getting along fine, were eliciting play in the fall, at this point may displace each other. They may avoid the same individual. I see this a lot with mixed genders. I've had many females wake up and they had wanted nothing to do with the male for a few months, and basically just until they kind of get back into the normal phase. Bears that maybe ignored each other last year are now playing with each other because all their needs are met. And so they're going in and occupying their time and meeting their social needs. They will start to seek out caretakers as their activity increases. Types of activities that you continue to focus on is their nest building, social interactions, and the increase of foraging. Dens should still not be disturbed or cleaned up until you are sure that all your bears have vacated their dens and are not needing them. Slowly increase your enrichment, changing from those nesting life strategy focus to social interactions and foraging life strategies throughout the day. At this point, you can ease back into positive reinforcement training, but keep in mind your training criteria is going to need to be relaxed for a little bit, especially for your complex behaviors. The bears may be very slow to engage, so kind of wait on them to know that it's time to train. They could also still be just really slow once you start a training session, kind of needing a few sessions to kind of, oh yeah, this is what we're doing. I got this, no big deal. At this time, you would also be adding in your preventative meds again. So based on your discussions with your vet team, you may have decided not to disturb your bears during torpor, and so preventative meds were put on hold. It's really important to get these started up again as soon as the bears are taking food so that you can help them rid their bodies of any parasites from torpor. It's really common in the spring that you're going to see in your fecals that the bears are shedding things like roundworms. So this entire process can take a few days. It can take up to a couple weeks, depending on the individual body condition and just how well the bears were in torpor. So a couple common mistakes that we'll see with staff during this time of year is that everyone's really excited to get back to your normal routine with the bears. You want to do the training, you want to do the enrichment. But if you move too quickly, it's too much for the bears at the time. And what you're going to see is that they get cranky, they may get aggressive, they're cranky with each other, they're cranky towards you. You'll see the following day, if you've moved too quickly in your routines, the following day, they're going to sleep even longer. It's like they have to have time out again and rest and rebuild their reserves. They could see some destructive behaviors, some fits that include things like fence biting. So really make sure that you wait until the bear seeks you out and not jump in just because we're all excited to start that new behavior or see how they interact with this enrichment. Another note that I've discovered over the years working particularly with black bears is if you think maybe your bear is awake, but they're just sleeping all day, every day when they're in this phase, put up some cameras, look at what's happening overnight. It's really common based on natural behavior of black bears that they will shift and be nocturnal because that's how they would avoid disturbances and avoid other bears or get to the resources that are difficult to get to during the day. And so they will easily shift into that pattern when they come out of torpor, when they're in walking hibernation. So your bear may look like they're still in walking hibernation because they've been active all night doing bear things and they're sleeping all day when you're around. So just a tip, kind of add that into your routine and make sure that your bears aren't doing some avoidance behaviors as well. So body condition and diet obviously is really important for bears. When they come out of dormancy, it's really important that they're not thin. They're really not losing weight during torpor. They're losing the majority of their weight during walking hibernation. So they should still be quite heavy when they come out of their dens, and their weight loss will happen naturally as they're starting to exert more energy and use up those fat reserves, but their caloric intake remains low. So your diet should still be very minimum. We're trying to mimic as much as we can with what they would be eating and when they would be eating certain food types in the wild. So their caloric intake will be low. You're going to slowly increase that up to what is your normal levels based on your individual bears. This is going to be a highly vegetarian diet, a lot of browse, vegetables at this time, but you can still sprinkle in small amounts of protein or fat, lipids, nuts, things like that, because they would be finding those items in the wild, anything that had overwintered. Staff a lot of times will make the mistake of jumping into a full regular bear diet as soon as possible. And those additional calories is what actually causes our captive bears to become obese, not the fat that they're putting on for torpor. And they don't get the chance to burn off that torpor weight. So it builds year from year and then therefore gives you your obese bears. So what does an obese bear look like versus a torpor bear? For me, if you're looking at these bears, and an obese bear is going to have the appearance of very short legs. They're going to have the rolls on their neck, on their shoulder areas going down their shoulder, they're into their legs, on their belly. So really looking for those rolls. When a bear is in torpor fat, it almost looks like kind of that skin has stretched and you're not seeing as much of the rolls because the skin is not stretching and then staying at that state. Instead, it's going back into their normal body condition each year. So I recommend to help guide you to kind of know what the size that your bears should be based on their body condition is not necessarily have a weight that's set, and definitely don't have a weight that is a goal across all your bears. Make sure it's individualistic. But instead, take photographs. Take a photograph of your bear in the late fall. Take photographs of your bear when they're first up, and kind of create your own body condition score chart to kind of see where they are year from year once that animal is an adult animal, so that they'll be stable in their weight range. And as you can see on the graph here, you're going to have a significant change in body weight throughout the year. So use these as guides, but let the bear's behavior actually dictate what they need for body condition so that they are set for torpor. So stage 3, the normal phase, summertime. This is when you guys are going to be increasing the food availability for your bears as the summer passes. You're also going to be increasing the number of feeds you're offering per day. Each feed should be offered to encourage all your foraging life strategies. A great deal of enrichment is also needed, mimicking normal feeding strategies, mental challenges, social strategies, as often as you can throughout the day, making sure there is enough enrichment and enough food for all the bears that are housed together. Browse should also continue to be offered regularly, and it's really important for the bears to eat, but also to use for nesting material. Your positive reinforcement training can be happening daily and multiple times a day at this time. It's great to bring your bears on your exhibit fence lines and use that as an interaction for your guest as well to incorporate it into your day. The habitat needs to be very complex, especially if you've got a lot of bears. You need to think about, do you have enough vertical space for all? Do you have enough shade, shelter, pools, visual barriers, logs, varied substrate that accommodates the needs of every individual bear? And be watching how your different bears use their environment and make sure they're not being displaced and can't use a resource based on social dynamics. Continue to give them options for nesting materials for them to create their day beds. As I mentioned earlier, day beds are really important this time of year for bears. So we have to make sure that that habitat provides for that need. Behavior in your bears, they're going to start to lose patience towards the end of summer, especially anything that they really have to problem solve as their appetites begin to grow. So again, the reminder that a lot of food needs to be available at all times for the bears, 24 hours a day, enrichment to all the animals, enough for everyone, so you don't have aggression. Stage 4, hyperphasia. This is the fun time for all of us as we're feeding bears, and this can be anywhere from August to October. It's regionally dependent, and colder climates could easily start earlier than that. This is when our bears eat, and they eat all the time. And they know by internal cues that they need to be building their fat reserves for their upcoming dormancy. It's important to feed the bears the appropriate volume of diet, but also it's important to feed them the appropriate types of food as well. And this has to be based on each individual bear's need. So we'll be using a variety of seasonal produce, a variety of seasonal foods that you have available. This really can impact their behavior. So again, berries, roots, vegetables, all sorts of nuts, lipids, animal proteins, but also plant proteins are really important and should make up a lot of the diet at this point, the carbs, the fats, those kind of things. We should be trying to make sure our bears are fed on a 24-hour period to avoid stereotypies at this time of year, and finding ways to satiate our bears for longer periods of time. So the use of things like your large carcass feeds, gigantic popsicles that they have to work on, automatic feeders, really complex puzzle feeders that don't frustrate the bears, but there's just a slow time release to things like chow that become available. You might find yourselves you're shifting and feeding these animals probably every 2 hours, if not even more frequent, to stay up with their demands, unless you're doing these large carcass feeds, huge feeds that can satiate them. Their appetites are going to jump really rapidly, and it's important that you stay ahead of their caloric needs so that you don't create stereotypies and anticipatory behaviors. I recommend at least boosting your diet 25% of the kilocalories every time you do a diet increase, and then be doing your diet increases before the bear needs them, so you're staying ahead. And you're increasing volume, but you're increasing the kilocalories. But it's important to know that you may be increasing, let's say, salmon at this time of year, but you're going to start decreasing greens and some of their produce as well. So it's a kind of a mix of both happening at the same time. You also should keep in mind, based on the subspecies of bear that you have, in particular, if you know you have coastals or Kodiak brown bears, they will generally show you behaviorally that they need more protein than if you also have grizzlies. You can see an increase in anticipatory behavior, you can see aggression, you can see fence biting. They also just seem to need the protein a little bit earlier. So it's not just a volume, it's the time of year that they will need those different food types. Your husbandry routine at this time of year is going to focus a lot on feeding strategies. Non-related food enrichment really is going to hold little interest with your bears, especially if their caloric need is not met. So if you want to do all the other enrichment stuff, which is still really important, make sure the bears are satiated, and then they're more willing to engage with everything else that's going on. If those needs are not being met, you're going to see a lot of resource guarding. You're going to see, displays of arguments and stuff like that of who's going to get to what. Positive reinforcement training continues this time of year. Have multiple sessions throughout your day, but it's important to keep in mind, because your bears are so hungry, that they are going to need a really good meal before you start your training session, because they won't be able to focus. Also keep in mind, what do you have in your training bucket? If it's too high of a reward, they might not be able to focus because they just want that item. Fall transition now is your husbandry routine is going to slowly start changing to your torpor management that you've got planned out. It's a slow reduction of all activity and all disturbances around the bears. And everything happens based on the bear's behavior and their body conditions, where we just kind of let them dictate when they're ready to go down. Enrichment is going to start shifting to cover other living strategies, particularly nesting and denning, instead of the strong focus on foraging that you had. Training criteria will need to start relaxing and eventually disappear, especially recall and shifting behaviors, complex behaviors. The bears will not be able to focus to do the behaviors that you have as maintenance behaviors at this time. So a clear sign that, training should have already ended is you're going to see your bears are going to frustrate easy in a training session. They are going to be really slow to shift or recall. They could start playing with the food items. They're going to shift in the doorways. Every little thing is going to get their attention versus the actual training session keeping their attention. So as you get rid of your training sessions for the season, any preventative medications or any veterinary procedure stuff should all disappear for the year as well. So in advance, have a meeting with your vet department, be planning out how you're going to do this. The bears are going to withdraw from food, so they're going to automatically taper themselves off of some meds. So you need to have those discussions to make sure that you don't need to start some of this earlier in order to set everything up for success for torpor. We don't want to leave a bear that does need to be tapered off, but he's no longer got the drive to eat, that he's doing it himself and cause any complications with his medical treatments. Continue to provide bears 24 access to their den, but all of their habitat, let them come and go as they please. Start stopping any activity around the habitat, tours, training, maintenance, doing certain work that would be too much stimuli that's going to wake up your bears that are starting to settle in. Your diet is going to adjust down based on the bear's need, from the first reduction of volume, reduction of different food types, and gradually transition it into something that is just like a one type food. Usually that's bear omnivore or a chow-based diet. It could also be something like acorns, depending on your area. And the goal of the single food is that the bears don't get up for it, but it's there if they're not nutritionally set for torpor, that they have the ability to continue to eat food and make themselves ready for torpor. Things that kind of watch for in your bears: as you start decreasing that food, some of the bears may now start thinking that there's not going to be enough food available and they're not going to make it, and you're going to see them start to gorge on it. So you may have to initially, as you're reducing all the variety of food, increase the dry food amount, the chow, just for a little while, until the bears realize behaviorally there's going to be enough food for all. And, if you've got a bear that no matter what, they're not settling down, you might also try boosting that individual bear with some more fat, some more protein. They're probably telling you there's either external stimuli that's keeping them up or a social issue, but a lot of times it's just they're not nutritionally ready. So you can try supplementing feeding that individual bear. So den selection, we don't completely understand why or where a bear wants certain things. So it's really important that we just give them lots of denning opportunities so that they can make the choice of what's the best den for them. If you are in a habit area where they can dig their own den, fantastic. Make sure that the habitat supports that digging, that nothing will collapse on them. So this is having a lot of down trees, root balls, that they can dig under. That creates a great ceiling for those dens. Make sure they have access to it all the time with a lot of bedding, and then they can move that bedding around as needed if they choose that a different den is more important. At this time, if you are not providing enough vegetation and enough bedding for the bears, they'll start to basically destroy your landscape. They're looking for anything they can use for nesting material. So it's important in the spring, make sure you guys are replanting your exhibits to kind of offset the damage the bears may be doing at this time. You're going to see a dramatic shift in your activity budget from foraging behaviors to denning behaviors as they start to go through metabolic depression. As they're gaining that weight, these bears in particular just look like everything is exhausting. The respiratory rate goes up. They're just tired for the amount of time it takes them to gather up all of that vegetation. All right, we're going to do another poll real quick. This one is multiple choice, so you can select all the different ones that you are using currently with your bears. Okay, great. All right, so it looks like a lot of people are using their night house or their holding area as their torpor dens. Some have exhibit concrete areas and others allow their bears to build their own. Fantastic. Thank you for the participation in that. And so what I want to kind of show you real quick, because dens themselves are really important, and I think it's an area that we don't do great in exhibit design. We think a lot about maternal dens, but not so much about torpor dens. So the dens here are probably pretty familiar with you guys. They're concrete dens on exhibit. They're usually like culverts or something like that that are built into your habitats. These are actually great for shelter, not so much for torpor. These are designed with visitors in mind, not the bear in mind. And the reason is these are not useful for the bears for thermal regulation and acoustical disturbances that you're going to have in your environment. So these dens, on the other hand, are keeping the bears in mind and the needs that the bears have, gives them choice control of what is important for them. For those that maybe joined us in Scotland, there was a poster presentation from a biologist that is working in forests that have been logged. In the bottom two photos, you can see her at one den that they've built and another artificial den they've built that actually bears in the wild are using when these forests have been logged. So I think we can take things like that and incorporate it into our habitats instead of these culvert style dens. And that's because the entrances are too wide. They're getting too much weather. They're getting too much temperature changes coming in. The acoustics are horrible when you have that open entrance. When we think about it, your entrance is guided towards your viewing deck so that visitors can see the bears. But in torpor, that's not what we want. And a lot of our exhibits, we're guilty of this all the time. You know, maybe that bear exhibit is near a keeper area. It's near a cafe, a playground, a train. All of those are acoustical disturbances that can really affect your bears. So many of us, we do rely on our holding space for our dens, but we should still have the same criteria of thermal regulation and acoustic barriers in place in those dens and not just rely on the fact that it's a night house that's standard for most carnivores. So den entry is going to vary based on your individual bears, your latitude, et cetera, all the things we talked about before. Let the bears have full access to their habitat. Don't lock them into these denning areas. That way, if you've got a bear that needs to get up for any reason that's in a shallow torpor, they have the choice and ability to do that. The bears are going to be easily disturbed by any disturbances at this time of year. So pretty much from October to March, based on your area, your husbandry routine should cease. No enrichment, no training, no cleaning. Food availability is going to stop. All you're going to have is, like that child diet that's going to be piled in a location. And if a bear needs to get up because of nutrition, they have that food and water resources available to them. This is not when you are going on exhibit. You're not moving doors. You're not doing tours, none of that kind of stuff. You can do things like reroute if you use hot wire to outside of your fencing so you can check it externally and don't have to be in your exhibits. Look at If you've got management that's a little nervous of like, okay, well, we haven't seen our bear for a couple of days because they're in a den, there's a lot of indirect evidence in your guys' exhibits that you can be looking at to kind of know what your bears are doing. Is, you know, the vegetation in front of the den, is it moved out of the way, which tells you the bear got out? Do you see tracks? Do you see flattened grass, anything like that? Okay, so those are kind of just a quick overview, not as quick as I need on our time requirements right now, of things to kind of be thinking about on the different phases of how to help your bear go through a natural torpor. But, you know, a lot of us are dealing with facility concerns that affect us being allowed to have our bears go through a natural torpor. So one final poll here, I'm kind of curious to see what your guys' challenges are. You guys can select multiple choice again, and we'll kind of run through a few of these to kind of help you guys have some tips to work this in with your managers, your facilities, things like that. Okay, it looks like most people have participated. Good, good. Thank you guys so much for your comments. Looks like exhibit design is definitely a concern. It's too much stimuli throughout the year, safety, den designs, facility management. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So let's go through a few of these. We can add a lot of these in our Q&A. So things to think about. Maybe you've got health issues with the bear, the veterinary team doesn't necessarily understand that you shouldn't be feeding your bears at this time of year, other than the chow that's, you know, outside of their den area. Accessing them for any meds or treatments can really disturb them. So have those meetings in advance, talk to them about how this causes chronic stress, how this is, you know, really is detrimental to their well-being. Temperate bears are designed to do this. And most vets that I've worked with, they're really on board. They just kind of need to see where their parameters are. You know, what's the latest in the year? How early, you know, would your bears be up? And once they get into that routine, they understand it and are really super supportive of going through this. Talk to your development team, anyone who's doing your tours and your donors. This shouldn't be the time that you're doing anything with the bears. So in your routines, what other species do you work with that you could now switch the focus to them? Are you paired up with, let's say, wolves? So and wolves are really just, they're in their heyday in the middle of winter. Focus on them as for all these tours. So you're still giving them an option and not just saying no. Construction and exhibit maintenance, that can be a tough one. We have a lot of priorities with our facility. That's a huge department that we're saying, no, I can't have you do this work around them. So making sure that when you're putting in your work orders, when your managers and stuff are looking at, you know, bigger like capital changes, that you're putting these timelines in and that you're sharing with them why it's important that it doesn't happen during torpor. I recommend bringing these teams in and let them meet the bears, have that interaction. They really get excited that you're going to these links to care for the bears and usually completely understand. There's always exceptions, but most people want to help you have great success with torpor. Volunteers, interns, work areas, all of that should be rerouted to other species for this time of year. You could be getting pushback because this changes the visitor experience. They can't see bears. Bears are a huge marketing draw. We, a lot of times, will have our marketing team really push bears and hyperphasia. And then they also set up people before they get to the zoo to understand that bears won't be visible. And this is why. So they're setting the stage and setting that expectation. So it's not the disappointment when they do come on grounds. And then you can do kind of whole campaign when the bears wake up, come see the bears, you know, they're up for the first time of the year. And that can be a lot of fun for your visitors. Marketing, help them emphasize the winter loving species. It gives them a variety of what to promote, and which they really love. gives them variety, it gives them different conservation messages, welfare messages. So there's a lot of different things that you can work with that department as well. Your events, if you're doing any sort of like holiday celebration, bears shouldn't be a part of that. But a fun way to flip that to, again, give your events team and your marketing team something to campaign is do Christmas in July when the bears are wanting all these food resources anyway. It's a lot of fun to have those activities at a different time of the year. Graphics are really important. There was one slide that showed a graphic we use with our visitors to explain to people as they walk by at all the viewing decks that this is why they don't see the bears and why it's important for them to go through torpor. And with the graphics, we also continue keeper chats. Even though the bears aren't visible, we do torpor chats and we educate the visitors of why they're not seeing the bears, why it's important to the bears. And usually a lot of our visitors, even though they're asking where are the bears, they're so excited that we're going to these links to provide as natural of an experience as possible for these animals. And they never thought about it. It's a great way to tie in your bear aware messaging as well of how much it's different if you go out into the forest right now when the bears are in torpor versus the things that you would think about when the bears are in hyperphasia and you're out camping. So a lot of great messaging that you can tie in. You might have managers that are concerned about the keeper schedule, things like that. Your guys' routine obviously is going to change because you're not doing the cleaning and tours that are related to bears. There's a lot of good data that you should still be collecting, a lot of records about patterns of entry and exit, body condition. Are they building their dens when they emerge? What is the temperature of the dens? What is it compared to your ambient temperature? How does your bear-made den temperature compared to your man-made den? So you kind of know how to change your facilities for next year. So you can completely change your focus on a lot of the record keeping that you do. There may be some budget and some commissary concerns when you're in hyperphagia. It's do you have enough prep area, storage area for all the food coming in, and then the reverse of that in torpor, making sure we're not wasting food that came in later in the season, but it's not being fed to bears. So communication with them is important. But we also might just be a little nervous for emergency response. If the bears have made their den on exhibit and they're underground or in, whatever you've built for them, they're not going to recall for an emergency situation. So kind of walking through those procedures with your staff, walking through where you might want a camera placement, how to look at your exhibit to know if an animal's, woken up and moved around their environment is really important. And just, get everyone involved. The more people involved, the more buy-in you're going to have and more success having a full natural torpor. So with all of those considerations, with all of the concerns about allowing your bears to go through torpor, I wanted to share just briefly a couple benefits of torpor and why it's so important for these guys to go through all these seasonal phases. A bear not allowed to go through these phases doesn't have the opportunity to fully den. They become slow moving, they're short tempered, they're unsuccessful to participate in just normal husbandry management. Their body condition is not what it needs to be. It's because they stay in walking hibernation. They stay in this metabolic depression long beyond what their body was built to do. There's been a lot of cool studies about hibernation. They've shown how it affects cellular aging. So at the cell level, that these bears that in particular are not hibernating because they're near human development and therefore they're having food availability in mild climates, they're getting accelerated cellular aging if they're not allowed to go through this entire denning process. So I think that's important to know. I mean, we're affecting them at a cellular level if they don't go through torpor. Bears in this state have just this amazing ability to heal wounds and to rid themselves of any foreign body. So you'll see this a lot in the rehab settings, that an animal that was injured, they've got them set for hibernation, they get them fattened up, they go through torpor, and they come out and they're physically almost healed, if not completely healed, from broken bones to just, injuries on their legs and whatnot. And it also is the same true for any mental issues that you're seeing with your bears, stereotypies, relationships between different social groupings of your bears, trauma that they've come to based on, how you've acquired that bear. Letting them go through these cycles seems to almost have like a reset button for them. And it does vary with each individual, and it varies based on how deep the torpor is. But it's really just important for mental and physical health of your animal. It's important for things like nail health, as well as they dig out those dens and kind of trim back their nails naturally. So I know this was a lot, or I feel like it was a lot of stuff that I was, chatting with you guys about. But I know we've run a little long, but we're still good to answer questions. So feel free to start throwing those in the chat and we'll answer everything we can.
Sorry about that. It took me a minute to get back on here. Thank you, Angela. That was fantastic. I do have a couple questions for you. What if you have a bear that is on medication that they need to take year round? Like say you have a bear on like blood pressure medication or something that really needs to be taken year round. How do you deal with that when they go into torpor?
Yeah, great question. I've had actually many conversations with the vets with this, and it becomes that risk assessment, depending on the age of that bear and what would happen if they're off that, is it worth, trying to see if full torpor actually medically improves the bear when they wake up. And so, have those discussions, pull in the research, what goes through, what happens with their body, and make the decision if it's worth that risk or not based on their medical needs. And if you guys decide that you can't take that risk, just allow the bear to do as fully of a torpor as you can. Reduce all your disturbances as much as possible, but choose to have that bear in an area that you can access them and give them that med if needed, but then reduce everything else that you possibly can.
All right. Another question, if you have a bear that has dug a den on exhibit and they're hibernating and you have an emergency and you need to get into that exhibit, how do you deal with
that? You can't, depending on your regulations of being in with the bear. But generally when these bears are in the den, and if you're doing a full torpor, before I came to Oakland, I was working in the Northwest, and you would have windstorms, and our bears were on exhibit. They had dug out dens. And so it was a risk that you would get large tree fall on your fence lines. The bears don't seem to even understand that even happened. They're still sound asleep in their dens. So I think put your protocols together, understand what it would take. Are you guys willing to take that risk with your response teams that you need to step in? What can you do on the outside? Can you kind of redirect some of your maybe hot wire to reduce the size of that enclosure? These bears are also not going to be focused on doing anything towards you at that point, because if you think about when you wake up, from a nap and you're rudely awakened, it takes a while for everything to kind of kick in. So more than likely, if they were to come out of the den and something spooked them, they're going to stay completely away. But usually most things you can kind of redirect from the outside of this exhibit and kind of think about those processes with your response team. That do you feel it would be safe in those situations? If you've got cameras on the dens, which is possible, even underground on exhibit with Wi-Fi and stuff like that, that you can have someone watching the bear. Is the entrance to the den still covered? So they still have vegetation covering the den, which lets you know that they're asleep in there.
All right, great. Let's see, we just had a couple more questions come in. Are there any perceived challenges for preparing bears for a first torpor at an older age? For example, we have 2 bears that are 16 years old and have not been allowed to go into torpor to date and have just experienced walking hibernation.
Yeah, age, no, other than the bear probably isn't physically ready to go into torpor. If you haven't had your body condition variability, your diet variability that you need for torpor. So kind of start working all those things in, allowing the bears to sleep, bringing them your disturbances away from the bears. What I noticed for bears that haven't gone through full torpor is it can take a few years. Like each year you're going to see torpor change. 1, because you're learning and you're changing your husbandry routine, but 2, the bear is kind of learning. So they have their genetic part that's telling them what to do, but they also are used to being in the environment that they're in. So it's kind of odd for them to also not get up and do and interact with their enrichment, stuff like that. So just be patient and understand it's gonna change a little every year as you set them up for success. And kind of take that and consider, start looking at your information and what you need to change for the following year so that they can go deeper and deeper. But as long as your bears have no concerns with your vet department at that point, go for it. It's fantastic for your bears.
All right, great. Let's see, with another question. We keep it at 20 degrees Celsius in our bear enclosures. They have a mixed enclosure with gray langurs. Can bears go into torpor at such a temperature if it's that warm?
Well, it's not just about temperature, it's also going to be about their body condition and disturbances. So, yeah, that's going to be a little warm. And I don't know if you have opportunity to maybe let them use an outdoor space or anything like that at that time. So they have some choice of where they want to den up, but you can still provide a lot of your nesting material. You can still reduce stimuli. You can still set them up with a seasonal diet and get them in their body condition. And then you're just, like I said before, kind of take it year from year and build on that based on what the bears show you. The thing you guys just need to keep in mind, it's individual to each bear. So every animal is going to act a little different. And it's not just external cues and external environment things that tells the bear to go in. It's also just in their DNA, their genetics, their gene expression is being regulated, up regulated and down regulated. So to an extent, they're doing it anyway. You're just holding them in walking hibernation.
All right, here's another one. We are looking to transfer our bear from a more forced husbandry method in a holding area and man-made den to a larger area in order to give him choice. The bear has made a den further up in the main enclosure. However, we can't let the bear den in that area due to maintaining the enclosure over the winter. However, he desperately wants to den there. The enclosure we're using this year is more manageable and will hopefully give him a choice to make another natural den. However, there is a man-made den nearby that he can also access. What is the likelihood of him creating a new natural den? And when should I transfer him from the larger main enclosure to this smaller habitat?
Okay. Yeah. And I've seen this with a lot of facilities, especially if they have like polar bears kind of sharing the same area as well, that you'll see a sub yard that you want your bears into. So if you've got a location you want the bears to go into for torpor, that's a smaller yard or whatnot, be setting that area up with as much bedding, with logs, with whatever that they can dig underneath and that they'll feel comfortable digging underneath. So a lot of substrate, and the substrate can't just be your dirt pile. This is like compact in the ground substrate that they can dig into. Some incline is important for the bears as well, boulders, things like that in that yard. I would start based on your location. When you want the bears to start digging there, you need to be ahead of what they're already doing on exhibit. So if they're digging out that den a month prior, they should have already had that other enclosure with all the things that you are hoping will encourage them to go over there. So it's kind of this game of really getting to know your bears and really learning the individual bears and how to read them so that you can kind of stay ahead of them on diet, on body condition, on their denning needs. But as soon as possible, give them that. If they're already underground, the likelihood that you're going to get them to move is very little to rebuild the den. So yeah, I would recommend doing that at least a month, giving them access to that other area and putting all the good nesting stuff that they really want over there based on the situation you're in. And hopefully in time, you can kind of redo your exhibit and make it where they can stay there and choose to dig out their den on exhibit.
All right, great. So we're almost at 4:15, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And any remaining questions, we will continue this discussion on Facebook over the next week. So the questions that we didn't get to today, we'll answer on Facebook. And then if anyone else has questions, please do get on Facebook and ask them, and we'll continue talking about this stuff. So thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. Our next webinar will take place on Monday, November 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Just a reminder that we will continue this discussion. I think I've gone over that. Please also look out for a follow-up email. After the webinar series is over, we are going to send out a survey to everyone. Your feedback will help us improve our webinars and give us an idea of what you'd like to see more of in the future. So thank you, Angela, for a great presentation. That was really informative and really interesting. And thank you everyone for making this a great webinar, and please continue to stay involved with the Bear Care Group on Facebook. Hope to see you guys next time. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Been great.